Hi guys, welcome to Talk with Claude. So this is my journal for what are we today? Ah, so this is Saturday, March 14th, 2020. So I was out and about today. Looked like there was a lot of people in the grocery stores out and about. Want to talk a little bit about So I've been thinking a little bit about the last week, what I expect is coming up, talking to people around town, got in contact a little bit with store owners and trying to get the pulse out there, what's going on. So, I mean, things have changed, obviously. I think there's a real hope and maybe a feeling amongst certain people that this is temporary, it'll pass, and then we'll be back to normal. But I don't think so. I think if you've been following what's been going on for a long time now, you know this event was actually long overdue. Everybody's focusing on coronavirus, because this it's coronavirus, and then all these bad things happen, and people started buying toilet paper, and there was a panic, and now people are like buying massive amounts and trying to resell them at inflated prices. But the coronavirus was the pin that pricked the bubble, but we were in a bubble for a really long time. To understand that, we have to go back to we have to go back quite a ways, actually. But basically, every time there's been a crisis, um, the central banks of the world, led by the Federal Reserve in the States, a lot of time they get out there and they reinflate the market. They pump a whole bunch of money. We saw this with the bailouts in 2008, 2009. Those bailouts had increased over a period of about 5 years, and they tried to taper back, and they couldn't. And then they brought back, like $50 billion a year, increased that to $500 billion. That's $500 billion every month. That's crazy stuff, right? And where's all this money going? It's going into mostly the stock market and in reinflating housing prices. So for sure we saw some inflation in regular items, but not that much. Um, we saw a phenomena called like um, shrinkflation and stagflation, which is kind of like companies, instead of raising their prices, they start to diminish either the quality or the quantity of their products and try to maintain the same pricing, which is just a way to at first hide the inflation. And also, stagflation is kind of like, if your income was allowed to grow at the same rate of the prices, then there would be this runaway inflation really fast. So by keeping the prices of everyday goods relatively low, um, and having a stagnation of the wages, the increase is very small. So you're constantly losing your purchasing power, but it's very subtle. It's very a little bit at a time. So you can always make these little compromise more, but it makes it really, really hard to put money aside. Also, with these extremely low interest rates, there's no motivation to put money in the bank, because you put it in the bank and there's like service fees and all that, and you end up with less money after. I mean, when I was a kid, you'd have like a 10, 12%, 16% interest rate. You'd put money in the bank, maybe, you'd save up, I was a kid, so you get like 20, 30, $40, between a few relatives for Christmas and your birthday. You put it in the bank, and after a year you get a little bit more back. You're like, okay, and you learn to save that way. Now you learn that if you leave money laying around too long, if you leave it laying around at home, then it just gets stolen. And if you leave it in the bank, it gets stolen by the bankers. a little bit at a time in service fees. So, and this is all for the privilege of being able to lend out your money, right? Because they need that money there to lend out. So, it's a different world than when I was very young, and you can accuse the 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 young folks of not saving all you want. That's just their reality. It's just really hard to save. I mean, not saying that you can't put a bit of money aside on your own and make the sacrifice of not, buying that extra cappuccino or whatever it is you drink, and putting that money aside slowly. But it's just not an environment that's as conducive to putting money aside as it was in the 60s and the 70s. Now, the markets, it's very different now. All this money that they've pumped into the markets, the Federal Reserve in the States announced that they added $1.5 trillion into pumping the market back up. Now, you have to understand, we have a crisis here that's not just a debt crisis like it was in 2008, right? So if you have a debt crisis, there's a freeze up because people don't trust each other to be able, like banks don't trust each other to be able to repay debt, so they don't want to lend anymore, and you have a freeze up of the entire system. Now you add liquidity, you add money to that kind of problem, and you'll put off the day of reckoning, because all of a sudden people, the banks will have the liquidity they need and everybody's reassured, and so things can start up again. But here we have the inflation of this debt bubble that's been going on, for the last since 12 years now, and that was a fix up of a debt bubble that happened for 8 years prior to that. So you have that situation, and now you have disruption in supply chains. Okay, I was talking to store owners today, and right now they're really uncertain as to whether or not they're going to be able to bring in goods into their store in the next few weeks, and how much of it they might order. They're getting orders. A lot of them were telling me they're getting about 2 to 3 weeks of business of people buying in 2 or 3 days, right? So the panic buying has ramped up demand by about sevenfold. So they're having a hard time keeping up, right? The shelves are going empty. They're putting in orders, but this is going on across the planet right now. It's everywhere. It's Australia, it's the States, Canada, UK, everywhere in Europe. I don't know what's going on in China. I'd imagine it's not all that different. So you've got a real problem, because now we have a problem of production. And if you have a problem of production and you suddenly increase the amount of money in the system, that's the perfect recipe for runaway inflation, right? Now, whether or not that money is going to find its way into ordinary people's hands is a different story. And, a lot of people were wondering, instead of giving all this money to the bank, why don't they, that 1.5 trillion would have been enough for everyone to, I've heard this, and I don't know if the math works out, but that's kind of irrelevant, because the idea is right. Okay, so 1.5 trillion, say that was enough to offer everyone, pay for everyone's health care, pay for the student loans that are outstanding, pay for, I don't know, people's mortgages or whatever it is. But here's the problem, and this is my guess as to why the Federal Reserve has all this money. All of a sudden they pull out of their ass, basically, $1.5 trillion, and there's more to come. Okay, that's just the beginning, and they just basically make it available to the banks and to the financial sector. and they don't give it directly to the people. So what are those institutions going to buy compared to what the people are going to buy? Okay, so if you give $1.5 trillion directly to the people, and I'm not saying there's no halfway point and other way to do this, but if you give it directly to the people, people buy consumer goods mainly. Okay, they're not going to buy capital goods to ramp up production for the most part. I mean, some of them might, but for the most part, people are going to go out and they're going to have all that. I mean, I saw a lot of people today in the stores that if they had had more money, they would have bought twice, 3 times as much as they did today. People are having, I could see the stress in their face trying to make this decision. Well, do I purchase this item or this item? I can't afford both, right? I've really got to make some choices. I'm going to overspend. I'm going to spend more than I usually would. I'm going to maybe put a bit more on my credit card because I know those things might not be available next week or the week after, or I might not be able to go out and get them because I'm sick or because too many people are sick or whatever it is, or because the local or provincial or federal government puts in place these draconian laws that force people to stay in their homes and not travel and all that, like they have in Italy and China. And that may very well be coming. So people are going out and spending money they basically, for the most part, don't have or wouldn't spend normally because of the uncertainty. But if they had more, they'd simply spend more, right? And what would that do? That'll do one of two things. Either in the first instance, they would do like what happened to the toilet paper. It would basically empty out the shelves because people, when they're scared, they'll buy much more. And if you can afford much more, then they tend to get that much more. And now to replace that, you have a scarce resource, you have a limited production, then people are going to jump in there and that's going to bring up the price. Okay. And I know it's easy to jump out and say, oh, that's greed, but people who produce the items, and I'm not talking about the people who bought like, I don't know, 50, 100 times more than they're going to use for the purpose of reselling at a profit. That's an entirely other story. But basically, the producers have costs as well, and the raw material and the labor that they need to increase in order to increase production to keep up with the demand, that's increased costs as well, right? And they have to plan around all that. And they, if they, whatever changes they make or ask people to work overtime to fill out the demands or whatnot, that's a real cost. That's real human labor cost. Extracting raw material of whatever it is, cutting down more trees or mining more ore or, getting more parts, that has a real cost as well, right? So you have to, whether you like it or not, that cost is going to get passed on, and in the end product is going to be more expensive. So you know it's a mix of things, but for what it's worth, yeah, if you have, it's a basic supply and demand principle. If you have, I don't know, to use an example of a podcast I saw lately where the person was explaining this. If you have 10 oranges and there's $20 circulating in the economy, and that's basically the simplified economy, that you have 10 oranges and $20. On average, those oranges are going to sell for about $2 each. If you go in and you dump $20 more into that economy, you have $40 for 10 oranges. You haven't increased the production, you've increased the money supply. Well, on average, those oranges are going to cost $4. And that doesn't mean that people buying are going to be more greedy. It just represents that same percentage of what they're willing to spend to fulfill that need that they have, right? So if you have a breakdown in production, which we do now, and on top of that, we start injecting a whole bunch of money, and that money makes its way out into the general economy, um, prices are going to go up huge. Now, the first people to acquire that money will be getting everything at a rebate, very similar to the people that go out when they start to learn, for example, that, there's toilet paper running out in Australia and you're in Canada, and then they go, okay, there's an opportunity to make a profit. I'm going to go out and buy all the toilet paper at the price right now. So you're not paying, the demands increased, but the prices haven't adjusted to the new demands. So you're going to take the risk that that demand is going to ramp up. You're going to buy everything up. And then when there's a shortage, you can sell at what would be the going price. Okay. Now there's this concept of fair price. And fair price is basically where demand and supply meet. And that's very dynamic. Okay. And unfortunately, sometimes, fair price when the first person to buy way more than he needed would normally have been more. That's when the price wasn't fair because demand was outstripping supply. But the prices that were already fixed didn't represent that. So it allowed somebody to grab more than he normally could have if the prices had matched that right away. And then he resells it at whatever he figures that people are going to be willing to pay for it. Okay. Now, the reality is toilet paper is practical, but, and, we're talking about one item amongst many here, but that seems to be the one that's going on in a shortage right now. The toilet paper is useful, but if you have running water in your home, you can always wash your bum. Okay, so you're making a decision to buy the toilet paper because you think it's still, I don't know, whatever they were selling it at on eBay, they're at $45 per pack. Or I saw the South Side Market today still had rolls. I took some pictures. Basically, these 4 tiny little rolls of toilet paper for $4. So it's like $1 $1 a roll. I've been in a situation before where the roll of toilet papers were going for $10 US a roll. And that was back in the late 90s. I was doing an expedition to Aconcagua, the high altitude mountain in Argentina. And for some reason, the whole base camp that was there, it was a huge base camp. It was the 100th anniversary of the first ascension. There was a whole lot of expeditions out there. And most expeditions ran into the same problem. They had an excess of food. So there was like nobody wanted to carry their food back out, and for most part it was like food that would keep and all that. So to lessen the load of walking out for 3 days with all this extra food that you didn't eat, people would actually go around to the other expedition, say, hey, do you guys want this pasta, do you want this dry rice or lentils or whatever it was that they had. So they had a bunch of food that they were basically giving away. So food at that time was basically free. Yeah, you could get I bet you an expedition could have walked out there without bringing any food that year if they arrived late enough in the season and picked up more than enough food, and they'd still have some to give away. However, everybody ran out of toilet paper. So, bad planning, and I got the shits that year too. So, I think there was something in the water as well that wasn't helping the situation, that made us underestimate the need for toilet paper. And also being sick at high altitude sometimes does that. So anyways, we ran out of toilet paper and had helped out an organized expedition the previous day because the storm popped up, and the cook was setting up his cooking tent, and this wind came up and just blew out his tent and all that. So we went running around, picking things up and holding things down while he put it back together. And then when we ran out of toilet paper, we kind of went over to the other expeditions, and then we found one guy was willing to sell a roll for $10 US. And I was really thinking about it, hesitating. And I was lucky enough, the fellow I'd helped out, the cook, came out and saw that he could see what was going on. And yeah, he came over and just gave me a roll. So, you know, I think currency can be many things. And sometimes there's real currency in good deeds and goodwill towards other people. So I'm thinking maybe in these times, that's probably a lesson that we're going to learn is, I think with this inflation that's coming, maybe people will run out of goods, they'll run out of money. But you don't, these hard times, what I find from what I've seen, and this situation here being, this crazy global situation that everybody's in right now, is fairly new. But hard times, in my experience, it either brings out the worst in people or it brings out the best in people. And that's a choice that you make every day. And, you have to realize that you have to take responsibility for yourself and your actions, and then for your family, and then you still have responsibility for your community. There's people that are going to need help. Ran into a friend today at the grocery store. He had been fighting cancer last year, had recovered, and I hadn't seen him in a while, and he was limping quite a bit, and he told me that he broke his femur 5 weeks ago. He's walking on it. I broke my femur as a kid, and I wasn't walking on it for quite some time. So, and it turns out that it wasn't a hard fall or anything like that. He actually, they actually found when he broke his leg that he's got bone cancer. So now I think he's going back in next week or in 2 weeks for radiation treatment. And, and that's happening to him in the midst of all this chaos, in the midst of all this uncertainty, knowing that, medical capacities might be completely maxed out with what's going on. So, I mean, that really rips my heart out for him. It's, and situations like that, it could be anybody, it could be me. I was pretty lucky. I had a situation that put me in the hospital there for 3 weeks in the fall, but that was hard enough. Thank God it wasn't amidst, a global pandemic. So, once you've set yourself up, don't lose those community ties. There's a real knee-jerk reaction, and I get it too, to go out and, hide out with my stuff in the woods somewhere and, be like this crazy guy that doesn't know that World War II's ended and he's still hiding out 20 years after. But I think community links and helping each other out, that's a real precious thing that sometimes we don't hear about a lot in the prepper world. But really consider making, you had the opportunity here to make some really strong links with people and set aside your differences and be able to talk without insult and without condemning everything, and just taking the time to really listen. And on that, it reminds me a lot. In 2011, I actually hooked up with our local Occupy movement here in Revelstoke, and one thing that I found that was drastically different then than what I've been seeing in these last few years is that you had the right and the left and everywhere in between, and we were actually able to talk in a very civilized, very caring way. um, for a short period there, people understood that the division isn't right and left and rich and poor. It's, you know, we're all, there's a real there's a real need for the people in power to divide the average folks, because so long as we're divided, it's easy to rule. And with what's going on, it's going to be a real temptation to use the powerlessness and the fear of the people to get them to react and demand more controls and demand that government do something and demand that their leaders take charge. And that can be a really, really bad play. And that'll stem from people not having paid attention and not getting prepared, but it'll also stem about from people that are prepared not willing to listen and extend out a hand, you know. And you're allowed your boundaries, but you have to understand that in desperate times people do desperate things. And so um yeah, it's important to use those tools like, you know, precision instruments. And I've made that mistake before too, but you know, you want to design life with a little scalpel, not necessarily with a battle axe, for lack of a better comparison. All right. So tell me what you think. What the what I'm expecting in the next little while. So, you know, I wouldn't be entirely surprised if the banks didn't open next week. I've said that before. They probably will. But with all these disruptions and the this on just in time delivery system and these overnight lending rates where, you know, accounts have to be settled overnight between the banks and all that, this much disruption in the market, in the supply chain, it may not be right away, but it's going to affect people's capacity to pay. All these events that are canceled. I'm looking at the tourism industry here in Revelstoke. Right now, there's people in town, but those trips were booked ahead of time. And even though, you know, the outbreak was starting, they're like, oh well, you know, we already paid. We've got our flights planned. It's all booked. We're gonna go. But um, but nobody's booking anything for, like, the hotels aren't being booked for the summer. Flights, I just learned that they are actually Vail Resorts is actually closing down huge number of resorts, including Whistler Blackcomb. So I mean, I've got friends that guide out there. That's going to be, I'm going to give him a call pretty soon this week here, get the pulse, what's going on there, you know, the backcountry guys and the resort people. But that's, I mean, that's huge. I mean, for Whistler, that's basically it. That's their economy. In Revelstoke here, we do have tourism. It's big. It's a big chunk of it. But I mean, we've got the railway, we've got forestry, we've got the dam, we've got a few other industries as well. But having said that, I mean, once one sector of the economy crawls to a halt, there's a real contagion effect, especially when, you know, borders are being closed and travel's being restricted. I mean, that's gonna, I'd expect that to have a lasting impact. So I don't think, I think the coronavirus is going to be reasonably short-lived. It'll probably peak in a month or two, um, is my guess, with the measures they take. I don't know how good the measures that they're taking, how much difference it's really making now that it's gotten into the different countries. Even if you close the borders, I'm sure it can help somehow, but um, it might slow down the progress so that the healthcare system can keep a handle on things. But that's going to peak. But I think the damage it's gonna do to the economy while this is happening, the restrictions are being increased. Um, I can't see that that's not gonna explode the dollar. Like with the amount of money they're gonna pump in to try to save the system, you can't have your cake and eat it too, right? So um, yeah, I'm really considering restarting the Stoke currency that I introduced in 2012 for Revelstoke. I'll give out some links below if anybody wants to take charge of that. I don't know that I'll have the time. We're expecting a baby in July, and I already have my hands quite full. But if somebody's willing to help with that, I think there's real potential to get people to produce and exchange stuff that wouldn't normally be produced in exchange if an alternative currency didn't exist. So if anybody is interested with that, leave some comments below and I'll check those out. And for people in other communities, that system that we use for the Stoke currency, that's actually a worldwide system run out of South Africa, actually, and it's very well done. So if you want more information about alternative currency systems for barter and exchange, leave some comments and I'll send you the links. I really feel there's going to be a real demand for that stuff to be able to trade locally, encourage people to produce that would normally just stay and wait for the government to come out and help. I mean, I don't know if the governments of the world are going to be overwhelmed with what's going on. So if anything, if they come through and that's what you're hoping for, fine, but I wouldn't sit there and just count on that. So the first step, of course, is what people have been doing. They've been going out and buying stuff that can help them last, a few weeks without having to, go to the store and in case, banks close and stores close or whatever. But after that, you have to think, how am I going to produce those things for me? And you don't necessarily have to produce everything, but if you can produce something that you feel is going to be of value to yourself and others, then you trade in your surplus for somebody else that's doing the same. And you'd be surprised how big a difference that can make sometimes. And it can be services, it can be goods. We're used to very cheap goods, right? Made in China, electronics, stuff that, we've gotten to take for granted. But um, it's quite, if you have to make those things that are made, in a corporate setting, in an assembly line from scratch by yourself, you'll find that the cost of the human labor cost of making something like that is almost unsurmountable. So you have to kind of think of what the essentials are going to be. The other thing I would really recommend is, if you're given the opportunity to have a say whether or not certain rules can be relaxed. Like we've been caring for animals within city limits for a while, despite people saying rules against us. We've had to, one of the hardest things we've had and one of the biggest obstacles we've had to our own production has not been the actual difficulty and challenges of animal husbandry. It's been people complaining for no reason about stuff that doesn't really affect them, just because they know, oh, it's this rule, and if you do it, then everybody will start doing it, or whatnot. Well, right now, if everybody started doing it, it'd be a bloody good thing, right? We had chickens laying eggs on this property when it wasn't allowed. Okay. And people, not everybody, a lot of people were quite happy and we exchanged eggs and all that. But some people were really, yeah, they just wanted to be pricks, I guess, and just, oh, it's not allowed. And I'm like, well, are the chickens going on your property? Are they damaging something? And what damage or injury are they causing you? And none, but it's not allowed. Okay. And it's that kind of attitude that enslaves us, makes us dependent on a system that, when the system doesn't work anymore, you're in real desperate need. And it just ticks me off, because those are the people that are going to need those animals the most, because they don't do that stuff, right? They want these nice, clean, neat properties, and no noise and no smells and all that, and that's their focus. Well, that's fine and dandy when you're getting all your processed food from the grocery store. When the system breaks down, that doesn't work anymore. And I've said this for years. We live in an extremely efficient system, but an efficient system isn't necessarily a secure system, right? The more efficient something is, the more susceptible it is to having one part of it break, and then the rest um, falls apart. And it's the same with currencies. I've worked with currencies quite a bit, and we have a very efficient currency. The debt-based system we have now, for all its wrongs and all its bad sides, it's extremely efficient at getting people to produce and overproduce. Okay, that's why people complain they're overworked and they're tired, and it's overconsumption. But that's what it's good at, for better or for worse. And we've had an abundance of stuff, and I think that's why there's such a movement to recycle. And I remember, learning of Robin the Paget family and building his Earthship, and then I looked into the Earthship model, and it came from this architect in New Mexico, and it's basically using like old tires and bottles and stuff that's so abundant, it's just laying in landfills, and reusing that to make these beautiful structures, efficient structures, efficient homes. It's quite labor intensive though, but um, so we live with all this abundance, and there's real potential that's not being tapped into. It's just starting now to get tapped into, reusing all this material to build great things, um, homes, right? Um, so the money system we have is very efficient for overproducing, but it's also extremely fragile. I was in the shipping industry for a while, and things are being shipped every day, and so they're being spent every day, and so it's just in time delivery. You're always like 24 48 hours from running out of stuff. And when something like the coronavirus comes along, and you have like an extremely debt-filled, debt-based money system that's based on nothing but the power of government to tax you in that form of money, right? Everybody understands that the only reason why everyone starves for dollars or pounds in the UK or whatever your local, or your I should say your national currency is called, is that your government taxes you in that form and will only accept payment in that form. And it creates an artificial demand for something that has no inherent value. And the value is derived from its being a debt to someone. So every dollar that circulates is owed plus interest to somebody. And although it's been floated that means because it's owed plus the debt, the debt can't be repaid because it's owed plus interest, right? That's not entirely true, because the debt and the interest is collected a little bit at a time. So it's dependent on that money circulating, right? And this is the real problem. So long as the money circulates, you can have less money than there is total debt. Even like total owed capital, you can actually function with less actual money, so long as it's circulating. But when you get an event that frees up the credit market, all of a sudden the money stops circulating. And if the money stops circulating, then you're not getting that money to be able to pay back mortgages, credit cards, car payments, right? And that means that whoever is supposed to get that money also owes money. It's this huge pyramid scheme. Everybody owes to somebody else, and as soon as it stops, then it's like damming up a river. It just, that dry spot just trickles downstream and dries out the whole thing. Um, so if we're like fish in water and you dam up the river, everything downstream, eventually it catches up to you and all the fishes die. So even if that money is always exchanged for goods, right? So if you have a lack of goods, even if you pump more money into it, it doesn't change the fact that the goods aren't there. So that just brings up the amount of money you need to pay them. So you can't solve the problem that way. So I expect there to be I'd say within 1 to 8 weeks, a real problem with the financial sector, with the banking sector. And it'll take one of two forms. Either the money will just run out, which is basically, people lost their jobs because there's interruptions, and then there's no production here, so there's no demand there. And then the contagion effect is that people lose their jobs, so other people lose their jobs, and also nobody has money to pay back their debts. The other form it could take is the government suddenly says, well, we're gonna give out money so that people can purchase the goods and all that. And then the goods, might be a slower process, and it'll probably feel good initially, especially if you're among the first to get the money, which is doubtful because usually they don't give money to people like you and me. They'll give money to the banks, the corporations. They're the ones who get the money. But eventually that money seeps into the economy. If the goods aren't being produced at the same rate, then you can get runaway inflation. As the money starts to circulate, there's panic buying because the goods aren't there. And so the spending happens as fast as the money's coming out. And you get this runaway inflation, this increase in the money velocity until the whole thing just blows up. And maybe that's something that's been brewing for a long time now, that's inevitable. So if something's inevitable, the only thing you can do is decide how it's going to happen and who it's going to benefit and who it's not going to benefit. Okay? And since I'm not in charge and you're not in charge, I can trust that the people who are going to decide who benefits are going to make themselves benefit, and their cronies and their friends around them. I don't think it's going to serve you and me. That being said, I've seen, especially with my experience in the hospital this fall, that good people, even in a very rotten system sometimes, can make such a difference. And I encourage each one of you to be those good people that that still cares. And I know it can be a lot to ask in tough times, but it's so important. It doesn't take 100% of the people to do that. Sometimes if we can get 1 in 10, get 1 in 10 people acting out of real goodwill and doing their best and still caring, that can make a huge difference in people's lives and in the outcome as well. So let me know what you think. If you have some questions or stuff that you'd like covered, write them down in the comments. Thanks for listening, everybody. I'm going to go up and watch a little show and snuggle into bed with my kids a little bit and enjoy the evening. Don't forget to be grateful every morning, every evening before you go to bed, because it's a hell of a lot easier to find everything that's wrong in the world and everything that's not working out than the stuff that is. But if you're listening to this podcast and I'm still here making it, there's still some good things happening and there's still stuff to be thankful for. So take care of yourselves, and I'll talk to you very soon. Okay, bye.